Hey, everybody, welcome back to another Latinos in Clinical Research live webinar, bright and early on a Tuesday morning. Here on the West Coast, it's 7 a.m. On the East Coast, it's 10 a.m. We just witnessed, if you're like me, you're watching the news, you saw Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin going to space. We've got some interesting things as well. I would say just as interesting things happening down here on Earth. We've got a special guest today, Rob Bohacs. Rob is the founder and CSO, Clinical Solutions Officer of ClinOne, who works with world-class pharmaceutical companies to rethink and redevelop how clinical trials should be managed with patient centricity, all of our favorite word, at its core. Rob believes that, and we're going to get into that, Rod. Rob believes that it's time to completely alter how we manage the interaction between research sites and patients, bringing trials directly to patients to simplify a very complex process through technology and automation. This is something the industry very much wants to see happen. We're going to talk about the challenges there, the reality of that happening. Rob has spent the last 10 years within clinical research, including CEO of an oncology CRO. I definitely want to talk about that. And site management organization. I definitely want to talk about that as a fellow site owner. That unified 320 oncology research centers across the US. Rob has received several accolades, including Top 19 Companies to Watch Award in 2019, Top Clinical Technology in 2019, the cover of CIO Applications magazine in 2018, and feature story of Pharma Tech Outlook magazine in 2019. Rob holds a master's in business administration from Grazidio School of Business Management, Pepperdine. I didn't know that, Rob. That's awesome. So welcome, Rob, to the show. Thank you for joining us on LICR.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show today.
So let's talk. There's a lot in your background. There are a lot of interesting stuff. Let's talk first. What was first, the CEO of the CRO or the SMO?
It was actually the same company. It was a combination approach to managing really a new generation of oncology trials and the challenges that poses to patients, site activation, and really being able to bring into a network effect these rural community oncology sites, which typically get overlooked in managing clinical trial opportunities.
Okay, that's interesting. That I have seen that model before too, where the site evolves into a CRO. Do you know a little bit the background of how that happened? Was it a site first? I get this question all the time from people who want to start CROs, and I tell them that's a very difficult thing to do. Best of luck to you. I suggest you start a site first. So what was it there first? Was it the site and then a CRO?
Yeah, the site network first. It really built a community practice alliance. So the challenge is, as you're probably well aware, is that at least sponsors will go to sites with big feasibility numbers, right? I'm going to go to Stanford because they have 200 potential candidates for me in this oncology indication. And if you're a small private oncology site in Bakersfield or other parts of California that are not centralized, then the challenge, of course, is that you'll never get selected to participate in that protocol, right? That's the reality. So we built a very large network across the U.S. so that these rural and community sites really empowered the patients to participate in trials by bringing their numbers together in a collaborative environment, right? And that's how we found a lot of patients who historically are underserved. If you don't live in the major metropolitan areas, it's very difficult to get to some of these research sites, as we're well aware. You can't always commute to UCLA or USC in Southern California, as an example. So if you wanted to reach the patients that really mattered the most, which are going to be patients in diverse populations, then you have to bring the trials to them. And that's the model we built. About 300 oncology sites across the US. They had a rapid activation model so that we didn't have to open those sites until a patient was pre-identified. When that happened, then we'd, in about 10 business days, get that site activated to be able to treat that patient. So logistically, it was all driven by technology so that we can get sites up and running very quickly, contract, right, CDAs, everything in budgets in place, everything's pre-negotiated. So it's a very effective way to bring trials to patients. And from there, we just move right into some of the CRO activities to support those studies as well.
Beautiful. There you guys go. You get sick of hearing it from me. I tell you, you want to start a CRO, go start a site. And they say, well, why, Dan? A CRO is better. I say, why is it better? They think it's more money. I say, yeah, top line more, bottom line, not so much. And how are you going to compete? What Rob just described from his previous company, and I could see where the seed was planted for ClinOne based on the things that you said. It makes sense now, but we'll get into that. Exactly how the seed was planted. Site first, guys, where the rubber meets the road. And by the way, this is still a very viable business. There's still a huge need for this, especially community-based oncology clinics. So anybody watching wanting to start a CRO, Rob, in about 2 minutes, just gave you a blueprint for how to do it. The work, the hustle is sold separately, but you have the roadmap in front of you. Just like Blue Origin had a roadmap to get to space, you have one too. So, Rob, I see where the seed was planted there, running that SMO and the CRO. Am I wrong in saying that that's where you saw the opportunity for ClinOne? When did that happen? When did the seeds start getting planted in your head for ClinOne?
Yeah, it took a little while. So that kind of seed for ClinOne happened around 2016 when I was departing that organization and moving into ClinOne itself, and realized there's just so much potential to use technology and automation to not just engage sites, but really move patients into the forefront of research. And of course, the challenge is we spend all of this cost on CRO services, lab services, logistics for IP management, and then how much we spend on the patient directly themselves to be a part of a trial is very small. So really, even when ClinOne started, the solution was very different. And then when we started to very heavily invest into patient-centric solutions, where I think that the future really lies in being able to support the journey of the patients, which we'll talk about a little bit today as well. But it kind of happened after really being able to influence and change behavior at sponsors. When I was with my previous company, the industry was not adopting to new technologies or new methodologies. It was really difficult to get the industry to shift and evolve around this patient-first model for enrollment. But we made lots of headway, which was great, but it was an incredible hard amount of work, right? It just wasn't happening by itself. So it took pilot programs, right, being able to be successful in engaging those patients and activating those sites rapidly, and then really move into adoption across those larger sponsors and mid-sized sponsors as well. Today, the industry is very receptive and open to change, probably not change fast enough, as we all are aware, but enough where they're opening the doors, having conversations very willingly. Back then, a CDA wasn't even standardized, right? 10 years ago, everything was custom developed. I need a CDA for this company, and it took 2 months to get a CDA in place. So different times back then. I'm excited to see how far the industry's come. We still have a very long ways to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the beginning. So what do you think the future of clinical research is? Because I know ClinOne definitely specializes in bringing the trial straight to the patient. And I've talked to this is Tech Month for Latinos in clinical research. So we've talked to many vendors, tech vendors in the space. Not all of them we did a webinar with. We just talked to a bunch of them throughout the month. And I'm learning a lot. And, they all understand that for their solution to work, you have to have the buy-in from the sites. What is your take on that and the future importance of this?
Yeah, I completely agree. Right? Even to use the ClinOne technologies as well as other technologies in the industry, you have to have buy-in for the sites. So a lot of our technologies that we built have come from the sites up, right? Meaning that they're very involved with us in developing workflow, how it works, what problems does it specifically solve, what does it integrate with at the site level so that they can use it effectively. But there are still times when we are struggling as a company with a small number of sites adopting our technology still, right? We still have a ways to go. And we're trying to get our hands around how do we solve that challenge ourselves as a company, right? Do we offer a potential virtual care coordinator who's a central coordinator for the study that supports the patients remotely if the sites are too busy? I think a couple of challenges that we see from a site perspective is that a coordinator, a nurse, and a PI, they're pulled in dozens of directions, right? Meaning that they have to manage drug accountability, IVR systems, any of the equipment that's shipped to the lab, being able to manage IP at the site level, all the monitoring visits, source documentations, everything's managed through them. And it seems like the patient component kind of falls almost last just because of the necessity and the pressure is on them to maintain a high degree of compliance on all the other items they're facing within a given study. So the question becomes, how do we help those sites out, do a better job of engaging those patients, or what else can we do to simplify their journey for us as well? The second challenge we face in the studies is that not all coordinators and nurses are created equal. There are some truly outstanding, amazing individuals who are coordinators and nurses and PIs and sub-Is supporting trials. And then there's ones that just simply aren't as talented or committed or trained to support the patient. So for a single study, you may have a coordinator that has very different experiences for their patients, which means there's inconsistency for the patient and their families as a part of trials. And the third piece is what happens when if it's a long trial, right? 3 years, 5 years, 8 years. And we see a lot of turnover from coordinators at the site. And we just did some patient interviews in the last couple of weeks where the patient and their family was on the 7th coordinator. And what does that mean for trying to understand what the expectations are when you're a part of a trial, right? As we know a protocol is between 50 and as high as maybe 200 pages. They're complex recipes for success. For that patient, it looks very foreign. And I think in certain areas and regions and demographics, it looks even more foreign, right? And there's a challenge because they have to follow that recipe as a patient. And as soon as you lose somebody to depend on and give you the guidance to be successful in that trial, or what do I do today? What do I do tomorrow? Patients feel disconnected. They're non-compliant, not on purpose. They just don't know what to do. And then they just withdraw from the study, right, prematurely at times. So there's a lot of challenges to fix around the inconsistency as well as the turnover with some of the studies and coordinators around the world.
Especially true in oncology. I know that firsthand as a oncology CRA. I've seen it myself, multiple coordinators, especially at the big academic medical centers. So I'm on your website, and we're going to get into the demo really quick and the Q&A. The first thing I see is recruit and enroll. So you have 3 pillars here. It looks like recruit and enroll, engage and interact, capture and monitor. So I know you kind of touched on these things, but MD referral to me is the one that stands out, maybe because it's first. But your proprietary opt-in network, 570,000 specialists. My mind's not even trained to see that. 570 and providers to generate referrals. How do you get 570,000 specialists to refer patients to sites they don't even know?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to answer that in a bit of a long-winded answer. So if I just cut me off if this is too long. So we launched our MD referral module about 4 years ago. It's one of our earlier modules as a company. And the solution came directly from the site. The site said to us very specifically, is there any way you can tell other sites around our site that we have trials that may benefit their patients, right? So if I'm just going to use the Southern California example again, just to be consistent. If I'm at UCLA, right, can you tell other affiliated providers or nearby providers or oncologists that I have a trial happening for my patients? Now, in some indications, referrals take place very commonly. In other indications, it's very competitive for the patients. And in the US, our behavior toward referring patients is very different versus Canada or Australia or across Europe, where our technology actually is, a little bit more effective than it is in the US, for example.
Wait. So let's break that down real quick. Why is it in the US? Why do you think it's it's harder here to get collaboration amongst the physicians.
Yeah, I think sadly, it's the dollars in play, right? The value of an oncology patient in research is somewhere between $20,000 to $40,000 per patient enrolled in a trial. So it's difficult to get a patient moved from UCLA to USC, which is a direct competing academic center, for example. However, we also know that in the LA Basin, there are thousands of providers that are affiliated with UCLA that are willing and open and able to get a patient referred over to UCLA for an oncology trial. So there's things that we've learned along the way. And one of the biggest benefits in the US, when you have a sufficient number of providers, is being able to look at the intra-institutional connectivity. And that's where the majority of the value of our software really is in the US. It's how do we connect with providers who are affiliated with a certain site so that there's visibility. And I'll give you an example, and I use this example quite a bit in my discussions, but right before the pandemic hit last year, I always spent a lot of time at sites, and I used to walk down the hallways of Boston Children's Hospital, right? The #1 research center in the world for pediatric clinical trials. And the way they communicate how clinical trials actually exist to their own providers inside their own building is that they print pieces of paper, they place them on a corkboard in a hallway, and hoping that another provider walks down the hallway, right, turns left and says, I've got a patient for that trial. And they literally tear off the phone number and email address from the bottom of that piece of paper, right?
Old
it's
school.
So antiquated. It is so antiquated. And that's within a building. That's right. That's not even into the community or across campus or into some of their affiliated sites. And that's what this technology solves. It connects the providers inside that building, so they're aware, into the community, and then, of course, deeply into some of the community and rural populations where they're not even aware of what's happening at Boston Children's Hospital or any of these facilities. It's a very proactive effort for outreach and managing that communication, and then organizing that as well. So what I mean by that is I'm going to take my example that I'm an independent oncologist, which we know less than half in the US participate in research. I could sign up to be a part of this communication model, and I could see what's happening at UCLA and USC and Providence Cancer Center, for example, all in one email, and it breaks it down by therapeutic focus. So I could just navigate a menu of what's available for my solid tumor patients, my hematology patients, and then break those out into subcategories of breast cancer, lung cancer, head and neck cancer, and then dive into what menu of studies are available. And it's kept dynamically up to date. So a lot of information that's on the web, whether it be clinicaltrials.gov or the institutional websites, they're out of date by 3 or 4 months. And we know that in oncology and rare disease, protocol amendments dynamically change trials consistently, right? A trial that opens today is going to be a different trial potentially in 12 months as we're changing the screening criteria. Maybe certain arms are closed or open, cohorts are open or closed, right? How do you keep up with this information? And again, those are some of the challenges we solve with the outbound communication with that solution.
Okay, I guess now is a good time to, if you want, share the demo you have or slides.
Yeah, I'll do that. Of course,
there we go. I'm on the website too. It's a good website, by the way. Very good website. When I got on there.
Oh, thank you.
Very easy.
A great team at ClinOne that manages that for us. So let me, speaking about MD Referral, we'll maybe dive into that portion of our solution itself. Let me just navigate away from some of these menus here. Okay.
And by the way, anybody with questions, put in the chat. And then Monica, feel free to interrupt at any time with a question. Monica Paula-Quitiva, or reading anyone's chat.
Yeah, feel free to ask any questions along the way here. Absolutely love to go through the technology. So speaking about MD Referral, I've got a visualization tool built into our software that allows us to see what's happening with the communication. So there's a dot in the middle of this. Bear with me as I zoom in the background. It's a blue dot. This is your site in Boston that's open and recruiting for a given study. This happens to be a sample oncology study, so it's sticking with our theme of conversation today. And we've told our technology to find all the oncologists and hematologists who've signed up to be a part of our network around the Boston area. So these gray dots on the screen are actual users of our software. And these are the individual users that are going to receive the communication from ClinOne right, twice per month. And those communications will include the list of trials that exist at the site in Boston. Of course, it gets to be very sophisticated in the back end where it can blend multiple trials or entire menu of trials depending on the opportunity for the Boston region. But this is where the outreach is going to go for this given study, with about 300 providers that have been identified in the digital radius. Their gray circle is really the limited digital radius that we put onto this study. This is completely flexible, which means that if we're looking for us to include some of the more rural populations to recruit from and engage providers deeply into the communities to bring awareness of that trial taking place in Boston, we can expand that radius. We can be 200 miles away, right? Particularly if there's a travel reimbursement policy for the patients where they don't mind traveling such great distances, for example, we're able to make sure that we're able to engage them, right? Historically, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. He's gonna.
Okay, have to mute. Please keep yourself muted. Thank you. Okay, that was not a question, Rob.
Oh, no problem. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. So these dots,
Great.
okay, these are specialists. These are not the sites you are scraping from clinicaltrials.gov, right?
Correct. These are going to be individual users who are part of our research network. And for this study and for this indication, right, we've selected oncologists and internal medicine providers around this site. We do that most likely in a first-line oncology setting where the patients are potentially transitioning from being pre-diagnosed, moving into an oncology setting where if you're trying to capture their attention for a clinical trial opportunity in that first-line setting, you have to really communicate to not only just the oncologist, but also the internal medicine providers who are providing kind of the early diagnosis of an oncology setting for a patient. Fundamentally, right, this is solving the challenge that no one's aware, right? No providers walking down the streets in Santa Monica or in Boston here, walking across that bridge at the Charles River with a lab coat that says, I'm managing this study from GSK or Lilly, right? If you need patients, right, tap me on my shoulder. It doesn't actually exist. I know we have some amazing technologies that are looking at taking very unstructured data from EHRs, doing some amazing data mining, correlation, NLP translations. I understand there's very sophisticated technologies there. We're taking a slightly different approach here and saying, how about we just make it visible, right? And that we're creating a visibility that the trial actually exists with your affiliated sites in the community that are not competing for that same research patient, so that everybody's aware that a study exists. The goal with this solution really in the next 5 years is that every single provider on the planet is signed up for this. And as soon as you have a clinical trial, we can let every provider know that may be seeing your patient to get them into the study potentially, right? That's a critical path for us. And we can alter the landscape of research and recruitment when we do that. No one's approaching it this way. And there's a couple of things that we're adding into this technology, for example, and that is going to take it beyond providers. Can we also communicate with patient support groups and registries, right? So no one's doing that effectively and systematically. And then also being able to communicate with some of the more sophisticated next generation sequencing labs in the future as well. So for example, if we're looking for a rare biomarker patient, we know that it's going to be very difficult for those patients to self-identify. Can we start to incorporate this communication and data integrations with some of the big central labs like a Foundation or a Caris, where, yeah, your specific mutations are going to be identified through labs, and the clinical trial will be available to you on that report when it becomes available to that provider.
I see.
So
you
we're
guys
working
are
on
with
the next
like
generation software.
Foundation One and those lab vendors, they're also integrated into your products?
Not yet, but they're on the roadmap to be there in the next 6 to 12 months. In my previous life, I had a very large relationship with Foundation Medicine doing just this.
Okay.
Was the timing of that premature by about 5 or 6 years? Absolutely. Now that we're seeing a lot of investments into biomarker-driven trials, which is the future for oncology, right? We have to find a way to identify these patients because that lab is going to be the one that says this patient is or is not eligible for a trial.
So Rob, I know And I know oncology is different. And then I know we had a question, and we'll get to that question from Monica. Monica will read it. But what I'm all about incentives for, as a business person, and all we do is think about how to create the right incentives for individuals, different stakeholders. And I understand oncology is a little bit different in that there's more of a I guess, concerted effort for the community to try to find the best solutions for patients, right? And you don't necessarily see that, or at least to that degree, in other indications. So I think oncology was a good indication to start with, although you guys are doing different indications I could see as well. But what's the incentive for like a clinician, first of all, to even use your product? I mean, we're talking about busy sites. Is it just for the altruistic, component? Like, hey, I have a patient here, triple negative breast cancer, very aggressive, tough to treat. We have some research options that I otherwise wouldn't be aware of. Like, what's the incentive for them? And then what would be the incentive for like a foundation or some of the labs?
Yeah. A great question. I think in some therapeutic areas, oncology, rare disease, right, even NASH, for example, some forms of CNS and Alzheimer's, we just haven't made a lot of progress in providing standard of care options for patients that are viable, right? Meaning that they're not overly aggressive in toxicity. They have a significant impact in efficacy, for example. So if we apply some of those considerations, there's still major disease categories that we're just starting to move the needle on. So the motivation from the providers is really getting a patient to a clinical trial that may provide them with some option because standard of care is limited or non-existent, right? Or to biomarker trial with some great initial efficacy data, or simply because of cost, because patients simply can't afford the current standard of care that's $8,000-9,000 a month per cycle. Patients struggle with that. So the motivation is going to be different for different patients. In oncology and rare disease, right, Alzheimer's, there are just significant unmet medical needs. So without research and us being able to move the bar forward, it's difficult to really improve the quality of lives for patients and their families. And that is the motivating factor. I think we as a company are always trying to think about how do we incentivize our providers to do a better job of getting a patient in a clinical trial. We're always thinking for outside the box. Even currently as a company, we're always putting our heads together about how do we overcome that hurdle and how do we create a better system, right? Could there be a method so that a non-financial impact to that site or that provider for referring your patients possible? We know there's regulations around that by region and by country, but we're thinking about that as well. Right now, it's finding options for patients that don't exist in highly competitive indications where there's lots of approved therapies, right? MDR is not going to be the right solution for you. There's just, there's little value to get a patient in a clinical trial, especially if there isn't an affordability problem, for example.
Monica, I know there's a few questions rolling through.
Hi, Rob. Thank you for joining us. This is an amazing technology. I really like it. Okay,
thank you.
So we have two questions, actually 3 questions. This is from Steve. In light of COVID and the various variants, are you seeing a diminished number of ongoing trials that are not related to COVID?
Yes, really in the last 14 months, we've seen a decrease in the number of trials that we've seen initiated by sponsors, absolutely. In certain indications, right, I'm just going to use oncology again, where there's life-threatening, mortal demand in terms of life expectancy or impact to life, there's just no choice but to provide the ability to still continue to activate trials. Even in oncology, right, where patients have no choice, they have to start treatment, they can't ignore it, they can't wait a year, right? Cancer is not going to wait for your COVID symptoms and risk to diminish. Those studies are still going to continue, even though we know that overall oncology enrollment is down significantly year over year as well. Sponsors still continuing to initiate those trials, yes. But overall, there's been a significant decrease. So I'm hoping as the world normalizes in the next 6 or 12 months, we're going to see this resurgence of new clinical trials. One thing that's really impactful that we've seen from COVID in terms of trials is it brought clinical trials to the average consumer, right? Healthy individuals that didn't have to worry about looking at clinical trial options for any kind of indications, all of a sudden were participating in COVID trials. And it's a very easy trial to participate in. We had hundreds of thousands of patients around the world who volunteered to be a part of COVID trials who never experienced clinical trials in the past. And it said, wow, I could be a part of a clinical trial. And the outcome was amazing, right? We saw very low toxicity and safety concerns, and we saw a very high degree of efficacy. And now we have this amazing vaccine that are multiple vaccines that are available around the world. So I think COVID, while it had a significant negative impact to the majority of clinical trials, what it did do is it provided visibility to the average consumer that I could be a part of a clinical trial, I can make a difference, and my experience wasn't that bad, right? So I'm really excited to take the motivation and the momentum that we've seen with COVID trial participation and use that in other indications and say, look, clinical trial is now for everybody. So we want to put a very positive perspective on what happened in the last 14, 15 months and allow patients to now be a part of more clinical trials. Sorry, very long-winded answer.
No, that's that's the answer, and it's amazing. I agree with you. The COVID give us a lot of awareness of the world in general about clinical trials, and that's the positive out of this negative situation. Well, for us. Okay.
One of the challenges sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say one more item to add in there is that I think COVID vaccines and really the FDA guidance and sponsors' perspective was that we need to enroll a diverse population from patients around the world, right? And there was a very significant effort to really bring clinical trials not just to the normal community around research sites, but how do we involve rural communities, underserved populations, make sure we get supportive demographic coverage across the world in the US to truly understand how these potential vaccines were impacting patients from different genomic makeups, right? Different regionalities and different populations overall. I don't think some of the targets were met, but there was a significant push to make sure we're including all sorts of populations in the clinical trials. And we know that some of these rural communities and populations are continue to be underserved, and that we can't develop medicines based around a small genomic makeup of patient populations. We have to really include the diverse populations from the US and around the world so that we get accurate, consistent responses from a safety and toxicity profile, as well as efficacy across a broader demographic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then, okay, so we have another question. Is it much more difficult to recruit during COVID?
Absolutely. I think a lot of patients who, and I kind of point myself into these situations, a lot of patients who were at risk because they have some medical condition, right? They really did not want to leave their homes to be a part of a clinical trial. Right? I'm already at risk. I already have cardiovascular disease. I have diabetes. I have some compromised immune system. I'm the one most at risk with COVID and going outside. Now you want me to be a part of a clinical trial at a big institution where cases were rampant early on, right? So that's where a lot of technologies really emerged to bring the clinical trial to the patient at home. So if you have cardiovascular disease, can I be a part of that clinical trial without leaving my home, for example? So a lot of the technologies we supported in our other modules, besides the one we're seeing on our screen here, was around, can we get the patient to become familiar with that trial from their home? Can they review the consent and go through the consenting process completely remotely? Can we allow them to be a part of that clinical trial without actually setting foot into a clinic or a hospital or institution where they're exposed and have to increase risk from leaving their homes? So a lot of these decentralized clinical trials, remote clinical trial participation came from the patients who were really sick. They were the most at risk in terms of exposure to COVID and the impact and the risk of developing, life impact from COVID. How do we bring clinical trials to them? Because they're still trying to manage their other diseases or indications in the background. They didn't have a choice.
Yeah, and Rob, did this change a little bit when the vaccine came into place?
Yes, earlier this year with the deployment of the vaccine, we saw more and more patients willing to go back to traditional site visits and be a part of research. However, really in the last 3 weeks, with the significant concern and rising around the Delta variant, is now we're going back into another mindset of, okay, even though I'm vaccinated, I'm really concerned about what I read in the news. And therefore now I'm going back to where I was a year ago. So we're seeing this constant evolution and shift of a patient that didn't want to leave their home because they're at risk of developing COVID. Once they're vaccinated, they were able to go back and really consider what clinical trials are a part of. And now again, with the rise of the Delta variant and some of the risk associated with that as well, now we're going back to the previous mindsets. We're still a ways away from being back to normal. And I think it continues to have significant impact on clinical trial and recruitment overall, right? Rightfully so.
Yeah. Okay, the next question, the next person, Remy, he says, hello, Rob. I'm excited to join the Zoom. What is the incentive for CRA looking for work?
I'm just thinking that CRAs right now are in really high demand once again, which is important for us. But we may see the landscape change. I think when before COVID happened, right, the CRA spent a lot of time on airplanes, visiting sites, doing on-site monitoring. And now with the challenge with COVID and some of the changes of protocol at sites, we're going to see that remote monitoring of source documentation is going to become a standard practice. So we may see, and I don't quite have the full answer for this here, we may see the evolution of a CRA role being a lot more remote and working a lot more remotely than spending a lot of time on site to provide the oversight and monitoring of that particular institution based on the continued risk and challenges for that role as well. CRAs are in very high demand, from my understanding of the world around us. We have a huge gap in the number of CRAs we need to support trials today, and certainly that the continued invigoration of trials in the near future. I'm just concerned that that role is going to change a little bit from where it was in the past. Instead of spending 70% of your time on a plane visiting sites, it may open the door for a lot more remote monitoring. We certainly are working on that capability as a company as well, so that you can remotely monitor source documentation, information around consent, patient diaries, anything that can be reviewed and monitored remotely, I think is going to be in big demand for the future.
How about for the CRCs?
Great question. I feel bad for CRCs. I feel like we're going through a big technology uptake, and it requires the CRCs to adopt to using all sorts of technologies, right? How do I remotely consent a patient? I've moved some of my visits to telemedicine visits. I'm now looking at data from wearables from a patient that's wearing it inside their homes to understand how their vital signs are from home. So huge need for CRCs. We will always have big demand. I think the CRCs will have to wear a very big technology hat into the future to blend that into their workflow of managing these patients remotely.
Okay, well, I mean, we all have to adapt somehow, right? It's just that COVID is pushing it to do it faster. Okay, and then and then we have Raphael. Hello, Rob. I might have missed this, but is your company able to conduct advertising and at the site level?
Great question. We currently don't have advertising at the site level. We're thinking about introducing a tool within our technology to help recruit sites for new studies. We currently don't have that functionality. Today, our technology is built exclusively for creating awareness from a institution to a particular provider around a site. So right now, we're really looking at provider-to-provider communication within our technology. However, we are exploring the option to also connect with some of the patient support groups. So if we want to advertise a clinical trial to a patient support group through our technology, we can potentially do that as well. It's not something that we have today, but we're considering and evaluating that today as a company.
Okay, I have, this is a question for me. How a company can do, or do they need to have a specific characteristics to be part of your system?
Great question. They don't. All of our technologies are going to be developed for bring your own device. So that means that we're able to allow the sites to use our technology across a broad number of the platforms, right? So our technology is really intended to work across a large number of technologies. We typically, as a company, do focus on more sophisticated indications. So depending on what kind of trials that you want to manage, we're here to help support that and provide the workflow and the technology to support that as well. And really, we want to simplify the research opportunity for sites as well. We want to make sure that if a site is just moving into the ability to conduct trials, right, can our technology make it easier for the CRC or the nurse or the PI or for the sub-I? So a lot of our technology is also working on the automation of workflow for those site users as well. We realize that some of the trials that we manage are incredibly complicated, right? We've managed some incredibly difficult oncology trials and other rare indications where the protocols were these large basket studies, and a regular site would really struggle with that. And we want to make sure that we can simplify that journey for that site user as well, so that we can enhance and motivate sites and encourage them to take on more challenging trials for their patients as well. I hope I answered your question okay. I may have missed the critical punch point here.
There is sometimes no easy way to explain it, but it's really I mean, this technology is really amazing, and obviously it will be nice to have it for all the therapeutic areas, right?
Yeah, that is correct.
Now, Rob, I know we gotta finish the demo here. Maybe we'll do like a speed round finishing the demo, but I gotta ask, is this how do you monetize? Is it I'm assuming it's the sponsors that would pay for this, right? Is there any fee on the side of the sites, the investigators, to use this?
Great question. Yeah, the majority of our commercial model is toward the sponsors, and then it's free for use for the sites. Occasionally, some of these major academic centers use portions of our technology as well. We've got a couple of very large, it's more than a couple, but we've got a couple hundred very large academic centers that use our e-consent, for example, just because we built one of the better ones in the marketplace. And they'll go ahead and purchase the technology directly from us to use across all of their studies as an enterprise. And then we also have some portion of our technology that sites can download and use completely complimentary, right? We want them to continue to have access to technologies that don't cost anything. And that was one of the ways we found at the company is this really free solution for sites, and then allow the sponsors to pay for a premium version when they want to provide that to their sites as a solution as well. We realize that we can't create technologies that are prohibitive for sites. We also know that there's limited budgets as well, and ultimately the value goes to the sponsor in terms of the automation, the improved compliance, the ease of use, the patient retention. All those elements are significantly benefiting not only the sites, particularly the patients, but primarily the sponsors.
Okay, gotcha. And I know there's a little bit left of the demo you want to get into, so feel free to do that.
Yeah, let me just change my screen here and get logged back in as a patient. I won't go into each one of these modules specifically, but I wanted to illustrate some of the key elements that we're here to support a given patient, right? And I'll just take 5 minutes and go through this. So as a part of our technology, we have ClinTrial Connect, which is our patient-facing product. This is really here to make sure the patient understands what they have to do to be successful in a clinical trial. We all use something like Google Maps or Apple Maps to get to our destination, right? The reason why is there's a little voice in the background that says, hey, turn left on First Street, right, and then make a right on Franklin Street to get to your destination, versus looking up in a map, right? We don't want to do that anymore. Clinical trials are unbelievably complex and certainly not getting easier. So we built a comprehensive platform that tells the patient what to do every single day to be successful in a clinical trial. And on top of that, it really starts with the fact that we engage not just a patient, but a caregiver, right? So I have significant family issues with very significant, mortal indications. My dad passed away of ALS about 2 years ago. My mom was recently diagnosed with breast cancer, right? And just going through some of the activities remotely, I am equally trying to understand, what's the best way to navigate and what they have to do. So we've created this solution, not just based on my family's needs, but everybody who's struggling with this, so that a family, the caregivers who involve and support the patient journey, understands what needs to happen with that patient to be successful. Number 2 is getting to a master calendar. All of us use some form of a calendar every single day so that we don't miss appointments and calls, right? Where do we go for the Zoom meeting today, for example? All those are critical details. So our technology really starts with the premise of a master calendar. I, as a patient, know what I have to do every single day for the next 18 months that I'm on this trial, right? That's really important, because we just don't have the bandwidth of a CRC calling every patient 3 times a day. Hey, Jane, it's time to take your medication. Hey, Jane, did you take your medication today? Hey, Jane, did you know you have an appointment tomorrow at 11 a.m., for example? So our technology does all these activities. One of the key elements that we built into our calendar event is our integration with Uber. So if a patient needs transportation to get to their visits, which a lot of patients do today, right, our technology will pick them up with the help of Uber in the background. That's actually Uber Health, which is a subsidiary of Uber itself, so that we protect PHI. These are really important pieces of our software to simplify that journey to get a patient to and from a visit, not have to worry about transportation, not have to worry about inclement weather. It breaks my heart to hear these scenarios where patients took like 4 buses just to get to their visit and have to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning, right? There's a better way to do that and treat our patients who are part of clinical trials better. And our integration with a calendar and map does that, of course, right? Being able to manage the consent process, again, thinking about the family centricity so that we can remotely consent and reconsent patients, absolutely critical, so they don't have to come in for an unexpected visit when we're just completing a revised version of an ICF, for example. Something like dosing compliance. Our system works through an interactive text so that patients know when to take their medication, and then they respond back that I've taken my medication or I've skipped my medication, right? These are small things, but it's kept very organized at the patient level. And of course, the patients can also look back in time and say, did I take my medication this morning, for example? So it's all built into this framework of managing the task for the patients. Of course, having a solution that can bridge the gap between the site and the patient on the telemedicine visits, all a research compliant solution, right? Absolutely critical. Being able to answer some of the surveys, the diaries, and the questionnaires that are part of clinical trials today is really important. We don't have to worry about a paper-based diary any longer. The paper-based questionnaires, those are very antiquated. It's all done electronically and simplified. And then really importantly, as a part of this framework, is that this platform that patients use is available in 55 different languages, right? We cannot continue to underserve certain populations, right? And clinical trials in the US are not English. They're not English and Spanish, right? They typically come in forms of about a dozen languages that we use systematically across the US and about 40 other languages we use across the world. We have to think about how do we make this easier for patients to participate versus being prohibitive because, English is not my primary language, right? I was born in another country. English is my 4th language. Still struggling with English, to be honest with you, but how do we present clinical trials so that patients from all diversities and backgrounds and languages can participate and not be a barrier is absolutely critical. I think these are small things, but they're absolutely critical to these patients. If you want to have this solution run in Italian for a trial in LA, you can absolutely do that. This level of flexibility, automation, ease of use, and then of course the accessibility by regional language requirements is absolutely critical. And I can't emphasize enough that if we're going to bring clinical trials to the masses, you have to do so on the patient's terms, that includes language, that includes regionality, and of course, really ease of use for those patients and the caregivers as well.
Okay, Rob, thank you. So are there any other, this is, I'm assuming this tools here for the sites, these would not be free, right? These, this would be a paid product for the sites.
That is correct. But the majority of the times, these are investments the sponsors are making, or the sites are pushing for reimbursement for this solution as well. So many times these technologies will be covered in the budgets that are negotiated with the sponsor as they're part of their pass-through budgets. At least that's our experience.
Gotcha. And then one final question, and then we can wrap it up. And I don't know if you may have answered this already. I mean, let me read it. By the way, former CRA Academy student asking this question. Shout out to Iman. And also, she's a guest lecturer of the CRA and CRC Academy. Had to get that plug in there. Are there any solutions on the horizons or that you can see to the problem with the lack of intraoperability and standardization between different platforms? That's basically the gist of her question.
Yeah, great question. The answer is yes. So at ClinOne, we've built our company and platform on a large API network. So this data works really well together. So we as a company are seeing some trends that data between your CTMS, your e-regulatory solution, your ClinOne solution is integrated together. We know that it's early on. We know that other major industries, right, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsofts have really figured out that systems have to talk to each other to be effective as a user product for a consumer and for a user as well. We are equally working and making investments there, but the industry is really far behind. I sit on the American Telemedicine Decentralized Clinical Trial Board, and data interoperability is a key element that we discuss every single month of how do we bridge that gap today, because these systems cannot be so siloed and independent from one another.
I gotcha. And by the way, Rob, and by the way, thank you. You gave us an hour. We used the entire hour. I appreciate you, your patience, and everyone else on here. Your English is great. I would have never known. Where were you born? I have to know.
I was born in Hungary, and then my family and I escaped when I was 8 years old and lived in a refugee camp in Austria. We were political refugees before we gained asylum to the U.S. So that was back in the days when the Soviet occupation had taken over Hungary. So it was back in the early 80s.
Gotcha. We're neighboring. I was born in Romania. We moved to the U.S. when I was 3. So I've actually been to Hungary a few times.
Okay.
Would have never guessed, Robert. Yeah,
never. No.
So we will put links to what should we put links to underneath? We have a link to. Should we just go to the website? Underneath
the website would be the
YouTube
best
channel?
Link. Absolutely.
Okay, ClinOne.com. And thank you everybody for attending. And thank you, Rob, very much for a great presentation. And we appreciate everybody who came on. And if you're watching the replay, make sure you connect with Rob on ClinOne.com.
Thank you so much, everybody.
No, thank you so much, Rob, for such an interesting presentation. Definitely, very interesting presentation. I really love this, your product.
Oh, thank you. I'm grateful for the time today, and thank you for putting together this great audience. And your contribution and webinars to research are significant. So please don't stop.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for the support, everybody. And we'll catch you all later at the next tech series next week on Tuesday. Take care.